All right, let's stage the set for our conversation tonight, America's Wild, Wild West. Let's take a look at some remarks that were made by the U.S. President and the U.S. Secretary of War following the arrest of Nicolas Maduro.
As the men and women of our military working with U.S. law enforcement successfully captured Maduro in the dead of night. So we're going to say until such time as we're going to run it, essentially, until such time as a proper transition can take place. We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country.
Our adversaries remain on notice. America can project our will anywhere, anytime. Nicolas Maduro had his chance, just like Iran had their chance. Until they didn't and until he didn't. He effed around and he found out.
All right. So, as you heard Trump say there, Maduro and his wife were captured in the dead of night in Caracas. And joining me to give more context to this, as America withdrew from 66 international organizations, including 31 UN entities, we have Wakili Evans Ogada, who is an advocate, as well as a lecturer of public international law. Karibu sana.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
All right. And we also have joining us virtually Dr. Hassan Kanenje, who is the director of the Horn Institute. Karibu sana, Dr. Kanenje.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. And we also have Richard Gowan of the International Crisis Group. He was UN director up until this last year. Now he deals with matters in the international institutions we're discussing, as well as international crises. Richard, thank you for joining us. He joins us from New York this evening.
Thank you for the invitation.
All right. I'll start with you, Wakili.
Yes.
F around and find out. And yeah, F around and find out, essentially. So what do you make of the US's actions in Venezuela?
Well, I have no business being diplomatic. I will call it for what I was trained to do as a lawyer. What the U.S. did in Venezuela amounts to aggression. And the crime of aggression is defined by various legal instruments. If we look at the UN General Assembly Resolution 3314 and Article 8 bis of the Rome Statute, they define what aggression is. And aggression basically is interference with the sovereignty, the territory, and the politics of another state by a state by use of power. And that is exactly what Trump's America did with the arrest of President Maduro, who we must remember is the president of a state equal in stature like the United States.
All right. Perhaps you can tell us, Richard, this is all happening as the U.S. has withdrawn from 66 international organizations, including 31 entities. It had already withdrawn from several prior to that. In fact, from the very moment President Donald Trump took his oath, has Trump essentially, in your view, by these actions, turned the rules-based international order on its head?
Well, President Trump told the New York Times this week that he doesn't need international law. And it is fairly clear, whether you're looking at his intervention in Venezuela or whether you're looking at his policies at the UN, that he simply does not care about multilateralism, international law, and international institutions. I think the aggression, the intervention in Venezuela was a very, very clear sign that from here on, we are going to have a US that doesn't try to get its way through law, doesn't try to get its way through diplomacy in many cases, but will use coercion and will use the threat of force to achieve its goals. And We've already seen US officials, including the president, making coded threats, some pretty explicit threats to other Latin American countries. And of course, we now have President Trump talking repeatedly about attempting to take over Greenland from Denmark and keeping the use of force on the table there too. So this is a very striking turn of events.
All right. I'll bring in Dr. Kanenje at this point. Has the U.S. ever really been a champion of multilateralism? And I ask that because as much as the U.S., will call on other countries to abide by these international rules and order, it itself hasn't been party to every treaty as concerns that, including the ICC. So is Trump just basically propagating, not necessarily, this isn't something necessarily new?
Yes. I think it's important to note that the U.S., and especially Donald Trump, is making a mockery of the rules-based international system, which the United States actually helped fund and establish. Now, even though it is true that there are many instances where the United States has been inconsistent when it comes to the application of international law, things have never gotten actually this bad. Like, this is pretty bad at this time. And I think to the extent that they are prepared not even to make any excuses, to be extremely blunt with regard to the instruments of power they tend to exercise in coercing other countries, is something, by and large, exactly unprecedented. And I think the future doesn't look exactly very good, considering the kind of environment internationally that exists today that is plagued with conflict and confusion as well as instability.
All right, so I'll ask you to come in again, Wakili. So this, people say under the Biden administration, there was a bounty, a $25 million US bounty on Maduro's head. And so this, which was raised to 50. So they're saying they were simply executing that. But, while we may have been told this was about narco-terrorism, Trump immediately, in the very same speech, went on to talk about oil. So what is it?
Well, the United States has no authority whatsoever in international law to arrest a sitting head of state. You cannot exercise the strength of your municipal court warrant to arrest a sitting head of state. The exception being only when you have an international court warrant. Your viewers will remember that in Kenya, for example, we had ICC warrants on President Uhuru Kenyatta and the then Vice President Ruto. And these were international warrants that we were bound to effect as of treaty obligation. We have a warrant right now on Benjamin Netanyahu for the atrocities happening in Gaza that we will be expected to implement because it's an international court warrant. But you cannot take a federal district court warrant from the US and purport to go kidnap a sitting head of state and then use the kind of ignorant language we see from state officials in the US to the effect that you F around and find out. That's arrogance, it is illegal, and in any context and situation, that should void this trial in its totality. Because from where I sit, the American courts do not have jurisdiction whatsoever to try President Maduro.
All right.
You can also note that they have already backpedaled. As they termed Maduro's arrest as premised on some narco enterprise. They now claim that the narco enterprise does not exist. So you can clearly see that the intention was camouflaged. The intention was not Maduro per se. The interest lies elsewhere.
All right. Richard, I'll ask you this question now. Is the UN Security Council essentially a defunct organ? Because it is mandated with keeping peace and security world over following World War II. But beyond statements, what really can the United Nations do in this instance?
There's very little that the UN can do when one of the veto powers in the Security Council chooses to undertake an act of aggression. And we have seen that repeatedly since 2022 in the case of Ukraine, because, of course, Russia has used its veto to block any criticisms of its action in Ukraine. Similarly, I don't think any member of the Security Council at the moment is planning to table a resolution condemning the US over Venezuela, because it would simply run into a US veto, and the US might find ways to penalize the country supporting a resolution of that type. The Security Council still is not completely dead. Even this US administration does find the council useful for some things. I think one example that probably a lot of viewers in Kenya are aware of is Haiti. The US actually has pushed quite hard to expand the mandate of the stabilization force in Haiti, which Kenya has been leading. But I think this is an administration which thinks that it can turn to the Security Council when it needs it, but it can entirely ignore the UN when it doesn't think that it's going to be very helpful.
All right, Dr. Kanenje, I was just looking at those images that were playing when Richard was speaking, and, you know, seeing Venezuelans with flags and celebrating Maduro's arrests. He was an authoritarian. His re-election was highly contested. So despite international statements saying this sets a dangerous precedent, the EU has not been quite as punchy as one would expect in an instance such as this. What does this, in your opinion, mean for Venezuelans?
One thing that is important for us to understand is that the images you are showing actually are mostly Venezuelans celebrating from the United States, especially those who are either living in exile or in the diaspora. There are also millions of Venezuelans who are actually not celebrating, and they've been in the streets in Caracas and elsewhere trying to protest against this, and not just in Venezuela, but all across Latin America, for instance. And there have been protests against Trump's actions in the United States, you know, in thousands. And so I think it's important for us not to be selective in choosing this. However, one thing that is very clear, and that is the kind of behavior we see today, it is not actually going to make Venezuela more peaceful. You see, Donald Trump said that, well, he's going to rule Venezuela from the United States. You cannot do that without boots on the ground. And to the extent that they are literally, you know, cutting away Venezuelan oil, doing international piracy in the high seas and stealing Venezuelan oil, this is clear theft. But that is not sustainable in trying to pacify the country. Venezuela is an extremely wealthy country when it comes to resources, but it's a country that has suffered extensive because of embargoes as well as sanctions. And so there is no justification just because you don't like a leader, you're actually going to remove them. Yes. Let's be honest, out of 193 countries of the United Nations, how many have legitimately elected leaders? There are many dictators and monarchs that the United States, as well as Western countries, are causing up to, who are committing horrendous crimes. So that's no justification to be able to remove a leader. Because the moment you say that president, then countries, both big and small, within their regions, where they find that perhaps they may exercise some kind of hegemonic influence, they may actually move against the leaders they do not like. We just had an election in a neighboring country, which many observers in the world and even in the region think it was really a farce. Now, should we move into that country to remove that leader because we don't like them, because they're not legitimately elected? Of course, we cannot do that, because that's not how international relations work. And the system, the current system that's rules-based, was established essentially to prevent those kind of behavior that may lead to another big conflict or a big war.
All right, I'll ask you, all of us, to listen to this particular soundbite, because Richard, I believe you mentioned Greenland, and Trump, while meeting oil executives, said he will make a deal with Denmark because Greenland is critical to the United Nations the United States security. Let's take a listen.
This isn't a country that's on the other side of the world. This isn't a country like we have to travel 24 hours in an airplane. This is Venezuela. It's in our area. The Don Road Doctrine. Colombia is very sick too, run by a sick man who likes making cocaine and selling it to the United States, and he's not going to be doing it very long.
So there will be an operation by the U.S. and
it sounds good to me.
All right. So U.S. President Donald Trump saying they're ready to go into Colombia. I believe Marco Rubio had spoken about Cuba should not sit too pretty either. And Trump, Marco Rubio, they've all made reference to this, our hemisphere, right? And he's mentioned the Danro Doctrine, which is sort of coined from Monroe Doctrine. Can you tell us a little bit about this? Does this mean now we are carving up the globe such that now there's the Western Hemisphere and everybody has their part?
Well,
or the global powers, that is.
For the viewers who don't know what the Monroe Doctrine is, the Monroe Doctrine is a policy that was formulated by the United States sometimes in the 30s that designated Latin America as an exclusive economic zone for the United States alone, to the exclusion of all others, including Europe. Now, of late, they have been threatened by the widespread influence of China, particularly trade-wise. China has a lot of trade interests in countries like Jamaica, Barbados rather, and countries within Latin America. So the US, being threatened by this emergence of China, has sought to militarily solve this expansion. And they are now bringing in this language you hear called the Danro, named after Donald Trump, where they believe that they can use military force and that kind of bellicose language to claim back their long-lost prestige in terms of Latin America. May I remind the viewers to look at the history of the United States and Latin America, for example. Look at 1954. President Jacobo Arbenz, duly elected in in Honduras, toppled by the United States via a coup. We have Salvador Allende in Chile, toppled. The United States helps a dictator in the name of this military man come in and reign over Chile through ruthlessness. And that characterizes the interaction of the US and that region. So the US needs to understand that for you to claim your lost sheen with Latin America and indeed the rest of the world, this has to be done politely, with respect, diplomatically, and respect people. You can't, for example, and they've been using this language to refer to brown and black people, shit-hole countries. You can't expect us to respect you when you collectively call Somalis with the kind of language we hear from the American officials just because you have problems with Representative Omar as a politician. So respect has to be brought back to the table. They have to know that this Lone Ranger approach they want to take will not help them. Instead, they are burning the bridges and they are helping China more.
Okay. Yeah. Richard, before I ask you lastly to weigh in on the question of how devastating is the withdrawal, Trump's withdrawal from the additional 31 UN entities. Dr. Kanenje, your last word on the situation as regards Venezuela?
I think it's important to underscore the point that Mike does not right. And the U.S. history of interventions, whether from, as my colleague has mentioned, Honduras, or installation of Augusto Pinochet, or the grabbing of the president of Panama, has not actually been well. In fact, most of the American interventions in Latin America has actually made things worse. Much like recent interventions have proved, you cannot be able to change a country in that manner. And so this, of course, is going ultimately to fail. And I think it's going to be helpful for the world to understand that despite this kind of crazy military adventurism of Donald Trump, this is not exactly the way that actually the future should look like. Because if we allow that to happen, then I can promise you we're going to have a pretty bad place to live as a world.
All right. Richard, your last word on how devastating an impact is the U.S. withdrawal from 31 UN entities?
Well, so the US has pulled out of a very wide range of UN entities, and primarily ones that are dealing with development, with climate change, with the promotion of international law, and also with the promotion of gender equality. Now, these are all issues which the Trump administration has been very negative about at the UN for the last year. So it wasn't really a surprise that the US is now starting to boycott many of these agencies. But I do think that it is indicative of the direction of travel for the US for at least the remainder of the Trump administration, which is that we are increasingly going to live in what some call an international community -1. We're going to live in a world where, still the major military power and in many ways the major economic power just is not engaging in forums of international law and cooperation. And I think the rest of the world is going to have to work out whether it can stand up for the international system or whether the international system is going to fragment if it doesn't have the US at the center trying to hold it together.
All right, we keep a watch. Thank you very much. That was Richard Gowan, who is the program director, International Crisis Group, and he is program director of Global Issues and Institutions. We've also had in studio an advocate, Evans Ogada, who is an advocate as well as a lecturer of public international law. Also joining us virtually, we've had Dr. Hassan Kaneje, who is the director of the Horn Institute. See you on the other side of this break. IEBC CEO must go. United Opposition makes calls for changes at IEBC ahead of 2027 elections. After this break.